During a family gathering, my daughter-in-law joked loudly, "I can't wait until the will kicks in and he's finally gone." My son laughed while everyone fell silent. I stared at her as she raised a glass to toast my final years. But she didn't know what I had recently changed in my estate that would. "I can't wait until the will kicks in and he's finally gone." The words sliced through the warm hum of conversation like a blade through silk, and I watched my daughter-in-law Leora tilt her champagne glass toward me with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. My son Dovan sat beside her grinning into his wine, and that low chuckle of his hit me harder than her cruelty, because it meant he knew exactly what she was saying, and he agreed with it. The entire dining room fell silent, and I could feel my sister Joanna's eyes burning into the side of my face, but I didn't turn to meet her gaze. My grandchildren stopped fidgeting, and even little Tessa, who was only 12 years old, seemed to understand that something terrible had just happened. I stood there at the head of the table where I had stood 1,000 times before when Mile was still alive, when this house was filled with real love, instead of whatever hollow performance this had become, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Elias Vile, at 68 years old, had built a life on precision and control, but age had made me withdraw into myself, and I had developed this habit of overthinking everything until I couldn't trust my own instincts anymore. I second-guessed every conversation and replayed every interaction looking for hidden meanings, and my obsessive need to understand people's motives had isolated me from almost everyone I cared about. I knew this about myself, but I couldn't stop it, and now standing here watching Leora's smug expression, I realized my paranoia might have been justified all along. She lowered her glass slowly, and her eyes flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. "You know I'm joking, Dad," she said, and her voice had that practiced lightness that I had heard her use 100 times before when she wanted to smooth over something cruel. But the way she glanced at Dovan told me everything I needed to know, because this wasn't a joke, and it never had been. 3 weeks ago I had changed everything and they didn't know it yet. 3 weeks ago I had sat in my attorney Harun's office and rewritten my entire estate plan because I had started noticing things. The way Leora asked about my medications with too much interest. The way Dovan suggested I should rest more often and let them handle my finances. The hushed phone conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room. I had told myself I was being paranoid, that my tendency to obsess over small details was making me see conspiracies where there were none, but something in my gut wouldn't let it go. So I changed the will and I didn't tell anyone, and now sitting here listening to Leora's casual cruelty, I knew I had made the right choice, even if part of me wished desperately that I had been wrong. "Of course you were joking," I said quietly, and I saw the relief flood her face. Dovan reached under the table and squeezed her hand, and I watched it all with the same detached observation I used to bring to blueprints and building plans. Calculate the stress points, identify the weaknesses, plan for failure before it happens. That night, after everyone left and the house fell into its familiar oppressive silence, I sat in my study and called Harun. "I want to add conditions," I told him, and I could hear the disapproval in his voice when he responded. "Elias, we already restructured everything last month. Are you sure you want to keep making changes?" "I'm sure. I want specific requirements. They get nothing unless they can prove genuine care, documentation, independent evaluations, years of involvement." There was a long pause. "This is going to create significant conflict." "Good," I said, and I meant it. Over the next 2 months, I became someone I barely recognized, and my worst traits came flooding to the surface like oil on water. I started recording conversations without telling anyone because I needed proof, and my obsessive nature drove me to catalog every interaction, every phone call, every whispered conversation I could overhear. I set up situations designed to test them, to see how they would react when they thought I wasn't paying attention. I pretended to be more confused than I was, more tired, more forgetful, and I watched how quickly they moved to take advantage of it. Leora started managing my calendar without asking, and Dovan volunteered to take over my banking, and I let them do it while documenting everything. My sister Joanna called me one afternoon, and I could hear the concern in her voice. "Elias, what's going on with you? You seem different." "I'm fine." "You're not fine, you're withdrawing from everyone. Tessa asked me why you won't talk to her anymore." That hit me hard because Tessa was the one person in this whole mess who I knew genuinely cared about me, but my paranoia had spread so far that I couldn't trust anyone, not even a 12-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong. "I'll talk to her," I said, but I didn't, and that failure ate at me even as I continued down this path I couldn't seem to stop myself from following. I knew I was becoming consumed by this, that my need to catch them in their deception was turning me into someone obsessive and cold, but I couldn't pull back. Every new piece of evidence I gathered fed the fire, and soon I wasn't just protecting myself anymore, I was building a case for total devastation. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon when I was pretending to nap in my bedroom, and I heard Leora on her phone in the hallway outside my door. Her voice was low, but not low enough, and I heard every word clearly. "It won't be long, he's already fadding. Dr. Marsh said maybe 6 months if we're lucky." There was a pause, and then she laughed, that same crystalline cruel laugh from the dinner party. "No, I'm not worried about the will. Doven says everything goes to him automatically. We just have to wait it out." My hands clenched on the bedspread, and I felt something dark and vengeful rise up in my chest. Dr. Marsh hadn't said anything of the sort, because I had just seen him last week and I was in perfect health. She was lying, or she was planning, or maybe both, and suddenly all my paranoid obsessive documenting felt completely justified. I wasn't crazy. I was right. They were waiting for me to die, and they were potentially trying to speed up the process. I called Haran that evening, and my voice was shaking with rage. "I need you to do something for me. I need you to schedule a formal will reading." "But Elias, you're not dying. Will readings happen after someone passes." "I know that. I want them to think I'm dying. I want to do the reading now, while I'm still alive, so I can see their faces when they learn the truth." Haran was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was heavy with resignation. "This is going to destroy your relationship with your son." "It's already destroyed," I said, and I believed it. 2 weeks later, I invited Doven and Leora to my study, for what I told them was an important family discussion. I could see the anticipation in Leora's eyes, the way she sat forward in her chair, like she was expecting good news. Doven looked uncomfortable, but he had developed this habit of deferring to his wife on everything, and he didn't question why I had asked them here. Haran sat behind my desk with a leather portfolio in front of him, and the afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. I remained standing near the fireplace because I wanted the psychological advantage of height, and I needed to see their faces clearly when the truth came out. "Thank you for coming," I said, and my voice sounded calmer than I felt. "I thought we should review the will together. Given recent conversations, I think it's important we're all on the same page." Leora's smile was practiced and perfect. "Of course, Dad, we're happy to discuss anything you need." Haran opened the portfolio and began reading in that precise attorney voice that made every word sound like a legal decree. The estate of Elias Weil, comprising the primary residence investment properties and all financial assets, will be transferred to the Mile Weil Memorial Foundation upon Mr. Weil's passing. I watched Leora's face, and it was like watching ice crack. "What?" Doven leaned forward, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "There has to be a mistake. The estate was supposed to come to me." "There's no mistake," I said quietly, and I felt a surge of dark satisfaction at their confusion. Haran continued reading. "All beneficiaries, including family members, may submit applications to receive distributions from the foundation, provided they meet the following criteria. First, a minimum of 5 years documented care and involvement in Mr. Weil's life, as verified by independent third-party evaluation. Second, quarterly check-ins with foundation administrators demonstrating genuine relationship maintenance. Third, evidence of financial independence and lack of coercion or undue influence in the relationship." "This is insane," Leora said, and her voice had lost all its practiced sweetness. "You're punishing us for what? For caring about you?" "For waiting for me to die," I said, and the words came out colder than I intended. "I heard you, Leora, 2 weeks ago on the phone outside my bedroom. You said I was fadding and you just had to wait it out." Her face went white. "You were listening." "I live here, I hear everything." Doven stood up and his face was flushed with anger. "So you turned our inheritance into some kind of sick game. You're testing whether we love you enough." "No," I said, and I met his eyes directly. "I'm protecting myself from people who see me as nothing more than a bank account with a heartbeat. You think I didn't notice the sudden interest in my health, the suggestions that I rest more and let you handle things, the way you both started managing my life without asking?" "We were trying to help you," Doven said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Were you?" I pulled out my phone and played one of the recordings I had made. Leora's voice filled the room crystal clear, talking to someone about how I was declining faster than expected and how they just needed to be patient. When it ended, the silence was suffocating. Leora stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You recorded me. What kind of person does that?" "The kind who knows when he's being manipulated," I said, and I felt my obsessive nature flaring up again, that need to prove I was right to justify every paranoid thought I had ever had. "You want to know what kind of person I am? I'm the kind who spent 2 months documenting every conversation, every lie, every manipulation, because I knew something was wrong and nobody believed me. My own sister thought I was losing my mind, but I wasn't. I was right." You're not right, Doven said, and his voice cracked. You're paranoid and controlling, and you've twisted everything into this conspiracy theory because you can't accept that maybe we actually cared about you. Did you, the question hung in the air, did you care about me, Doven, or did you care about what I could give you? He didn't answer, and that silence told me everything. Leora grabbed her purse and headed for the door. This is punishment. You're punishing us for something we didn't even do. No, I said quietly. This is protection. I'm protecting myself and my assets from people who stopped seeing me as a person a long time ago. We are leaving, Leora said, and she looked at Doven. We don't have to stay here and listen to this. They walked out, and I heard the front door slam hard enough to rattle the windows. Harun began gathering his papers, and I could feel his disapproval radiating across the room. Elias, I have to tell you, this was one of the most difficult meetings I've ever facilitated. But it was legal. Completely legal and completely devastating. He paused at the door. I hope you know what you've done. I do, I said, but as the words left my mouth, I felt something hollow open up inside me. The next 6 weeks were the longest of my life, and my obsessive nature, which had driven me to this point, now turned inward, consuming me with doubt and second-guessing. I replayed the meeting over and over, analyzing every word, every expression, wondering if I had gone too far. Doven didn't call and didn't visit, and when I tried to reach out to Tessa, her mother told me she didn't want to talk to me right now. Joanna came by once, and we sat in the kitchen drinking coffee in silence until she finally spoke. What did you do, Elias? I protected myself. From what? From your own son. From people who wanted me gone. She shook her head slowly. You don't know that. You think you know that because you've spent so much time looking for evidence that you've convinced yourself of something that might not even be true. This is what you do. You obsess and you analyze until you've created a whole narrative that fits what you want to believe. I have recordings, Joanna. I have proof. Proof of what? That your daughter-in-law is selfish and entitled. That's not the same as proof they were trying to hurt you. Maybe they were just being thoughtless. Maybe you could have talked to them instead of setting up this elaborate trap. Her words hit harder than I wanted to admit, because somewhere deep down I knew she was right. My obsessive need to catch them had turned into something darker, and now I was sitting alone in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. I had won the battle, but I wasn't sure what I had actually gained. That night I sat in my study staring at the phone, willing it to ring, willing Doven to call and yell at me or argue with me or anything that would prove there was still something worth salvaging. But the phone stayed silent, and I realized that in my need to protect myself, I had burned down every bridge that connected me to the people I loved. Then 2 months after the meeting, an envelope arrived from Harun's office marked urgent. Inside was a formal legal notice stating that Doven had filed to contest the will on grounds of undue influence and mental incompetence. Attached to the notice were documents I hadn't expected, recordings that Doven had apparently made of me, recordings I didn't know existed. I listened to them with growing horror because they painted a picture of someone paranoid and unstable, someone who ranted about conspiracies and saw threats in every interaction. And underneath those recordings were text messages between Leora and Doven, messages I should have seen coming but somehow missed. They weren't planning to hurt me. They were planning to have me declared incompetent. The messages laid it out clearly how they would use my obsessive behavior and paranoid recordings as evidence that I wasn't mentally fit to manage my own affairs. They would get guardianship, and then they would control everything without waiting for me to die at all. I sat there holding these documents and felt the world tilt sideways, because this meant I had been right all along, but I had also been wrong. They weren't waiting for me to die naturally. They were planning to take control while I was still alive, and my obsessive attempts to catch them had given them exactly the ammunition they needed to do it. I had played right into their hands, and now I was facing the possibility of losing not just my relationship with my son, but my autonomy, my freedom, my entire life. Harun called me that evening, and his voice was grim. Elias, we need to talk about your options. These recordings they paint a concerning picture. We're going to have to prove you're competent to manage your affairs, and given your recent behavior, that might be difficult. What recent behavior? The recordings, the surveillance, the elaborate will conditions. A judge might look at all of this and decide that you're not thinking clearly. I am thinking clearly. I was protecting myself. I know you believe that, but we're going to have to prove it. I'm recommending you undergo an independent psychological evaluation immediately. We need documentation that you're of sound mind before this goes any further. I agreed because I didn't have a choice. and for the next 3 weeks I submitted to a series of tests and interviews with a psychologist named Dr. Reeves, who asked me questions about my relationship with my son and my decision-making process and my emotional state. I tried to explain about the recordings and the evidence I had gathered, but every time I talked about it, I could see the concern growing in her eyes. Finally, she delivered her verdict in a written report that Haran read to me over the phone. Mr. Vile demonstrates obsessive tendencies and significant trust issues that have impacted his judgment and relationships. While he shows no signs of dementia or cognitive decline, his paranoid ideation and compulsive documentation behaviors suggest underlying anxiety that may benefit from therapeutic intervention. At this time, I cannot definitively state that his recent legal decisions were made with sound judgment. I listened to those words and felt everything I had worked for crumbling around me. I wasn't incompetent. I was anxious and obsessive, and my flaws had turned me into someone who looked unstable even when I was right. Haran continued talking about legal strategies and counterfilings, but I barely heard him because I was replaying every choice I had made over the past 4 months and seeing how each one had brought me closer to this moment. I had been so certain that I was protecting myself that I hadn't stopped to consider whether my protection was actually self-destruction. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and I spent those weeks preparing with Haran and trying to figure out how to prove I was sane when all the evidence suggested otherwise. The night before the hearing, Tessa showed up at my door with Joanna, and I almost didn't let them in because I couldn't bear to see the disappointment in their eyes. But Tessa pushed past her mother and wrapped her arms around me, and I felt something crack open in my chest. "Grandpa, I don't understand what's happening, but I know you're not crazy." I held her and tried not to cry because this 12-year-old girl had more faith in me than I had in myself. Joanna stood in the doorway watching us, and when Tessa finally pulled away, Joanna spoke quietly. "Elias, I brought something you need to see." She handed me her phone, and on the screen was a text message thread between her and Doven from 2 months ago before the will reading. In the messages, Doven talked about how worried he was about me, how he thought I was declining, and how Leora had convinced him that the best thing they could do was take control of my finances before I made bad decisions. He mentioned feeling guilty about it, but Leora kept reassuring him it was for my own good. "He's not evil," Joanna said softly. "He's weak, and she's manipulative, but I don't think he actually wants to hurt you." I read the messages again and again and saw my son in a different light. Not as a villain, but as someone who had been slowly convinced that his paranoid father needed to be saved from himself. And maybe he wasn't entirely wrong because I had become paranoid and obsessive, and I had pushed everyone away in my need to protect myself. The hearing the next day was brutal and clinical, and I sat across from Doven while lawyers argued about my mental state and my fitness to control my own estate. Leora sat beside him looking composed and professional, but I caught her glancing at Doven with that same controlling expression I had seen 100 times before. The judge asked me questions about why I had changed my will and why I had recorded conversations, and I answered as honestly as I could. "I was scared," I said, and my voice cracked. "I heard things that made me believe my family was waiting for me to die, and I didn't know how to handle it except to protect myself. Maybe I went too far. Maybe my fear made me see threats that weren't really there. But I'm not incompetent, I'm just alone." The judge looked at me for a long moment, and then at Doven, and then at the stack of evidence on both sides. "I'm going to order temporary conservatorship," she said finally. "Mr. Vile, you will retain control of your personal decisions, but major financial decisions will require approval from a court-appointed conservator until we can establish a clearer pattern of judgment. We'll reconvene in 6 months to reassess." It wasn't the total loss I had feared, but it wasn't a victory either. I had fought so hard to maintain control, and now I had lost it anyway, not because I was incompetent, but because I had behaved in ways that made me look incompetent. We filed out of the courtroom in silence, and in the hallway, Doven stopped and turned to face me. "Dad, I never wanted this." "Didn't you?" "No, I wanted to help you. Leora convinced me you were declining, and I believed her because I wanted to believe I was doing the right thing. But this whole thing, this war between us, it's destroying both of us." "Then why did you file the contestation?" He looked down. "Because she told me I had to. Because she said if I didn't you would cut me out completely and I'd lose you forever. I was scared too, Dad. Scared of losing my inheritance, but also scared of losing you." I looked at my son and saw someone I barely recognized, someone who had let fear and manipulation turn him into a weapon against his own father. But I also saw myself in him, that same weakness, that same tendency to let anxiety drive decisions that made everything worse. We were both flawed and broken, and we had both made terrible choices because of it. "Where do we go from here?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. and for the first time in months, he sounded honest. Over the next 6 months, things didn't magically fix themselves because real life doesn't work that way. Doven separated from Leora after discovering she had been having an affair with her business partner and had been planning to divorce him as soon as my estate was settled. That revelation hit him hard, and he spiraled for a while, drinking too much and avoiding everyone, including me. I attended court-mandated therapy sessions and worked with Dr. Reeves on my obsessive tendencies, and slowly grudgingly admitted that my paranoia had created as many problems as it had solved. The conservator assigned to my case was a woman named Margaret who was stern but fair, and she helped me understand that protecting myself didn't have to mean destroying everyone around me. Tessa started visiting me again on weekends, and we would sit in the garden and she would tell me about school and her friends, and slowly I remembered what it felt like to connect with someone without suspicion or fear. Joanna checked in regularly and pushed me to rebuild bridges instead of burning them, and eventually I started having dinner with Doven once a month. The conversations were awkward and painful, and we both avoided talking about Leora or the will or the recordings, but we showed up and that felt like something. At the 6-month review hearing, the judge looked at my progress reports and the conservator's recommendations and decided to lift the temporary conservatorship. Mr. Vile, you've demonstrated significant improvement in your decision-making and your ability to manage relationships in a healthy way. I'm satisfied that you're capable of managing your own affairs. It should have felt like a victory, but mostly it just felt like relief. I had my independence back, but I had also lost years of my life to fear and suspicion, and I couldn't get those back. The twist came 3 weeks after the conservatorship ended, when Haran called me into his office for an urgent meeting. He looked grim as he slid a folder across the desk toward me. Elias, there's something you need to see. During the discovery process for the contestation hearing, we obtained access to Leora's financial records. It appears she's been embezzling from your son's business for the past 2 years to the tune of approximately $300,000. I stared at the documents in front of me and felt a cold fury rise up. Does Doven know? Not yet. I wanted to tell you first because this changes everything. If she was stealing from him, she was likely planning to steal from you too. Your instincts about her weren't wrong, Elias. You just went about protecting yourself in the wrong way. So I had been right after all, but being right didn't feel like vindication anymore, it just felt empty. I called Doven and told him about the embezzlement, and listened to him break down over the phone as he realized the extent of Leora's betrayal. We filed criminal charges and Leora was arrested 3 days later, and the whole thing became a media circus that dragged our family through the mud. But through it all, Doven and I stayed in contact, talking more honestly than we had in years, and slowly rebuilding something that looked almost like trust. A year later, I sat in my garden with Tessa beside me watching the sunset, and she asked me if I regretted how everything had happened. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I regret how I handled it. I regret letting my fear turn me into someone I didn't recognize. But I don't regret protecting myself because I was right, even if I was right in the worst possible way. She nodded slowly, and we sat in comfortable silence while the sky turned purple and gold. My relationship with Doven would never be what it was before, but it was real now, built on honesty instead of obligation. The foundation I had created in Miles' name actually did good work funding arts education and supporting widows, and I found purpose in that. And I learned that sometimes being right isn't enough. Sometimes you have to be right in a way that doesn't destroy everything you love in the process. My flaws nearly cost me everything, but in the end they also saved me, because my obsessive documentation had created the paper trail that exposed Leora's crimes. I just wish I had found a way to protect myself without losing so much along the way.